Thank you, Star. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be reading with Nancy. For those of you that are working on your own works and trying to get them published, it wasn't that long ago that I was sitting next to a campfire with Nancy during the Utah Humanities Book Festival in Tremont at the Holmgren Family Farm. And that's where we met. And she asked me what I was working on. I said, I've got this manuscript that nobody wants to publish. And she talked to me for a while, asked me about it, and gave me a lot of encouragement. So she's a big sister to me. So keep working hard on your stuff. I really enjoyed the earlier readings today. They were spectacular, actually. I'm not going to use the microphone. Is that okay? Can everyone hear me?
Jessica, can the camera hear him okay?
Oh, if not, then I'll...
Probably it's...
Okay.
And this is your book. I forgot to bring my reading
good.
so
Okay.
I've already signed it.
Oh.
I'm going to give it to you with the
Okay.
fingerprints on it.
All right, I'll pay you the money.
This is called Dream House on Golan Drive, and I'm going to start with the opening chapter, which is called As for Me and My House, and it takes place here in Utah. I wanted to say, I was going to read a chapter that takes place in Logan. There's actually two chapters. But you're going to have to buy the book to read that one.
Buy the book, everybody.
Chapter 1. Riley was 10 when his father Gus told him that they would be moving into the new house. He said it was the work of the Lord, as the name of the street address indicated. It sounded like the beginning of one of Gus's clearing the throat lectures. Golan Drive, he said, like in Israel. Riley's father was well known on the church speaking circuit, a featured lecturer at firesides in Utah and adjacent states. Everyone assumed he was on his way to becoming one of the top brethren in Salt Lake City, which is how they all referred to the highest officers of the church. It wasn't that you could actually apply for the job of a general authority, all of whom were called directly by God, through the prophet, who sat at the top of the church administration. In the meantime, Gus sold life insurance and made the rounds to firesides, mostly in California. It was on one of those tours that he had met an enraptured college-age student who suggested to her parents that they sell Gus their second home in Utah for next to nothing. According to Gus, who wept at the Lord's goodness to his sprawling family, the young woman had said she wanted to lift Gus up like he had lifted her up spiritually. The new house in the Heights would suit the Hartleys, being in the foothills overlooking Utah Valley, she said. The family would be more visible there. They would like the way the high desert sunshine warmed the house in what Gus called, quote, a suburb set on a hill, to paraphrase the biblical term. The houses were so conspicuous it was as if they had been sculpted out of the mountains by a mining company. A few older homes were tastefully modest, but the new ones showed off their vaulted ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows, and wooden decks launched precipitously over the mountainside, looking like the prows of ships. Brother Hartley was educated, but not in a profession like the doctors and lawyers who made up the neighborhood and drove Lincolns and Mercedes-Benzes. Gus drove a Ford Falcon and didn't notice the difference. Other people had boats, and their kids had braces on their teeth. The Hartleys would have to do without some things. The day they moved in, a next-door neighbor arrived at the door bearing in her plump hands a casserole topped with potato chips. Marba Pratt, she said, introducing herself, like Abram in the Bible, but backwards. Everyone here calls the Heights Snob Hill, she added, rolling her eyes in mock disapproval, her face shiny from exertion. Snob Hill, said Joan. Riley's mother placed the dish carefully in the fridge and calculated that it would serve only 6. She glanced at her reflection in the plate glass window and adjusted her moving day hair before returning to her guest. All of the kids, 9 at the time, gathered around to stare at their new neighbor as if she were part of the local fauna. Most of the homes have valley views, Mrs. Pratt continued, looking around at the piles of boxes in the front hall. But we've had to be content with the view of your beautiful home, she said, and laughed so hard her bosom, a virtual shelf, leapt up and down under her floral dress. Mrs. Pratt could not stay long, she said, but paused long enough for Riley's mother to reveal what Mrs. Pratt and the other neighbors were hoping to confirm. "We're LDS," said Joan directly, opting for the official acronym of the church. "Oh, I know who you are," said their new neighbor. "We thought we recognized your husband's name. Welcome to the ward." Once this commonality was established, it was like the July sun had suddenly appeared in the room, and everything was good with the world. Soon the two women were touching one another's hands and arms as they talked and hugging each other goodbye, demonstrating that, like the refrain in the Pioneer hymn, all is well. I'm going to skip a chapter and jump to a chapter called Our Daily Bread. And this is referring to a test, an Abrahamic test, which is a spiritual test from God that Riley's father would receive later on in this book. Gus received his it's called Our Daily Bread. Gus received his Abrahamic test after his book was published. And one of the apostles in Salt Lake, Elder Gray, came to Provo and castigated him for its content. People thought Gus passed the test with flying colors, that the experience vaulted him nearer to what Jesus prescribed when he said, "Be therefore perfect, even as I, or your Father who is in heaven, is perfect." The shock waves from Gus's public humiliation reached me, one of the few people on earth who actually is perfect, although not in the way people usually mean when they quote the scripture. Another profound misreading of a text, if you ask me. And I should know, as one of the three immortals from the time of the Nephites, I've been here not only as long as the other two, but as long as the wandering Jew, as Varus as well. When you're one of us, you have to witness a whole lot of sacred writing over time getting twisted up, co-opted, to justify less than admirable needs. Whenever I run into him, as Varus shrugs at these observations of mine. "It's inevitable, get over it," he says. "It's the way of the world. What does it matter to you, Zed? How does it change your predicament?" "But the text, and stop calling it a text," he says. "They're just stories. They're not set in stone. Just stories? Exactly." Well, that is where Varus and I part company. Despite having a similar condition, we don't agree on much. My immortality is a calling, whereas his is a curse. More like a mistake that condemned him to become a 30-year-old all over again every 100 years. He grows older while I stay eternally middle-aged. Right now, I'm supposed to be keeping an eye on Riley, my current charge, named after his great-great-grandfather. Riley Reed, who had 3 wives and an adventurous spirit. The original Riley didn't mind crossing the Great Plains with his family in a covered wagon when he was 16, along with about 100 other Mormons. In fact, after they arrived in Great Salt Lake City, Riley wanted to push on to California because of the gold rush. Brigham Young didn't like it. "Brother Reed," the barrel-chested man said, jutting out his chin, "I prophesy that if you abandon your family and chase after filthy lucre, you'll lose every material possession you have." "I don't have any material possessions," said great-great-grandpa. "Nor will you have when you return. Just go and be damned," Brigham thundered. Gotta practice my Brigham Young. Riley promised that when he returned, he would bring a cast iron frying pan for his mother filled with gold. But on his return, he was robbed of everything but his pony, a pathetic animal that was so small Riley's feet nearly touched the ground as it clopped back into Great Salt Lake. Brother Brigham's prophecy had come to pass. Well, at least that's how the story gets told, how the Hartley family tells it now and again and again. In fact, great-great-grandpa Riley's family was overjoyed to see him, penniless though he was. Brigham took a different view, told him to get the hell out of his Zion. Poor Riley, crawling back wearing a battered miner's cap and no crown. Undaunted, the young man married a girl he met on the trail in California, whom he thereafter referred to as his frying pan of gold, and stayed put. He became a ward bishop with 3 wives and the father of 24 children. The Hartleys descended from the second wife, Anne, who followed Riley to Mexico when he moved there to escape arrest for polygamy and died with him in Colonia Juarez. In the solitary surviving photo, taken from an old tintype, he has the typical Reed forehead, broad as the business end of a shovel, and a wiry beard with salt and pepper bristles. His eyes look exactly like the dark and deeply set visage with thick brows that his great-great-grandson inherited. Looking into his ancestors' piercing eyes, the modern Riley wondered if his pioneering forebear was able to foresee the scraggly livestock and hard-earned orchards he would end up with in Chihuahua. Riley spent hours pawing through the myriad books of family history one of his unmarried aunts had patched together. I can't believe I just said aunts. Aunts had patched together. How could any of these grandparents have imagined where their offspring would end up? Living comfortably on the Provo bench. Other than the eyes, Riley was not anything like his spirited namesake. The most outdoor adventure the young man could hope for was with the Boy Scouts. "You're a pioneer too," his mother reassured him, but he recognized it as empty encouragement. "We all are," she said one day while kneading dough. Riley couldn't see how. It was his mother's habit to make 8 loaves of bread each week to help make the food budget stretch. She didn't enjoy baking, evidenced by how hard she threw the dough onto the counter to get rid of air bubbles. Riley thought that to be a pioneer you had to wear buckskin or gingham, a cowboy hat or a bonnet, and carry a rifle. Great-great-grandpa Riley's baby brother was trampled to death by oxen during a thunderstorm on their way to Utah. His mother had wanted to butcher the oxen, just like the oxen had butchered her boy. But on the trail, draft animals could not be spared. All they had to wrap that dead boy in was a burlap bag, Joan said, and stones to mark the grave. "We're pioneering modern life," she repeated, her nose powdered with fingerprints of flour. Riley knew his mother's blonde features from the Swedish side of the family were considered attractive, at one time earning her the epithet of the Mormon Grace Kelly when she competed in pageants. She handed Riley a bread pan to smear in shortening. Based on the family's new surroundings in their dream house, they were a far cry from being pioneers, he thought. He gingerly stuck his fingers into a square of wax paper and then into the can of shortening. "When we lived in L.A., she said, warming a little to the subject, "your father was called to be a counselor to the bishop. There were a lot of college students in the ward, and some of them were getting caught up in the hippie things. Our non-Mormon neighbors didn't think much of religion." "Why not?" Riley asked, diligently finger-painting the bread pan. Joan stopped talking for a few seconds to watch him. "Make sure you get the corners, Riley. Last time I tried to dump the bread onto the rack and the corners stuck." Her crabbiness at having to bake bread was manifesting itself. She monitored his progress for a while and then continued. UCLA was a nest of radicals, all of them getting caught up in that, all that stuff that was going on back then. "What stuff?" Riley said. "Well, there were students who were, taking pills to see pink elephants and things. Well, you've heard of the Flower Children, I'm sure, and, the Beatles, rebellious kids." His mother's ideas of danger in music and fashion were hopelessly dated. At that moment, Riley could have retreated to the older girls' room and listened to their hidden stash of LPs, including the suitable for framing album from Three Dog Night and Jesus Christ Superstar, which the church had expressly forbidden its members to attend. Even some of the married members of the church got involved, she said, buttering the loaves with a pat of margarine on top. "Remember the Sanders family?" she asked quietly. He did. On more than one occasion, Nicole Sanders and he had retreated to her parents' bedroom to pull down each other's pants and have a look. Her father was at UCLA getting his doctorate. Joan shook her head. Clyde wanted the church to give the priesthood to Negroes, she said, resting her veined, greased hands lightly on top of a cantaloupe-sized ball of dough. Riley could tell his mother was registering one of her rare moments of confessional reminiscence. Like the time she admitted that she didn't care if Elizabeth Taylor was vilified in the Love versus Lust tract, she still thought she was the definition of beauty. Riley nearly held his breath while his mother stared off into the distance. He was afraid that if he moved, he would remind her that he was still in the room. There was emotion in the silence, like bubbles rising in Muriel's lava lamp, until his mother suddenly remembered her bread duty. "The Lord is testing us, Riley," she said in her regular voice. "We don't know why Negroes aren't allowed to hold the priesthood. We're pioneers of faith. We have to believe that this is how the Lord wants it for now." What she meant was that the Lord would speak only to the prophet in Salt Lake City about such things. "What about Brother Sanders?" he asked, twirling his finger in the bottom of the pan. Clyde was getting the kids involved in marches and writing letters to the newspaper. She looked at him circumspectly. "He thought your dad was wrong for just accepting what the brethren were saying." She paused for a moment as if remembering something. "It was hard on your dad," she said. Then she threw the dough ball down so hard, Riley instinctively turned to see if any of the dishes behind him in the hutch had broken. None had. He turned back around. A tiny puff of flour sat innocently on each of Grace Kelly's breasts as a cloud filled the air in front of him, then settled onto the newly greased pan like lint. Ooh, sorry. If I take that one more time, just take it. Okay, so Riley, I'm going to read one more chapter and then call it a night, but the family ends up with a guest. And like all good plays, the guest comes in and turns over the entire family from the first act. And that's really what happens here. She's one of these hippies, actually, who is converted to Mormonism. So later on, it's time for him to go on a mission. And this is where Zedekiah makes his first appearance. I hope it's not too much of a spoiler, but it is like halfway through the book. It's called I, Zedekiah. "I keep telling Varys that I'm not back in New York because of the theater. I gave up that obsession nearly 100 years ago. He doesn't believe me. These days, when I excuse myself from time to time, he gives me that look and says something like, 'Yeah, give my best to Belle and the Beast,' or 'Say hello to Joe and Harper Pitt,' referring to two of the characters in Angels in America, which he knows gets me all verklempt. He knows I'm off to see Riley. On the streets of the Big Apple, there are Mormon missionaries in white shirts, backpacks, short hair, looking like they're fresh out of boot camp, which of course they are. Last week, Riley allowed two of them to stop him on 5th Avenue and 23rd Street in Sunset Park, where they addressed him in Spanish until he replied in English after telling them he was from Utah. Their eyes grew wide, and the color in their young necks got pinker. Riley waited almost with as much anticipation as they did to resolve the inevitable question. Are you Mormon? He knows what it's like for missionaries on the streets of New York, because a decade earlier he was at the swimming pool putting lifeguard trunks over his Speedo when his mother called to say that his mission call had arrived in the mail, that he should hurry home. He felt like his feet were in concrete, knowing this would signal the end of his carefree summer. Other people he knew were already on their way to their missions. Alan had finished a year at Dartmouth and was called to Japan. Other acquaintances were in Melbourne, Munich, Sao Paulo, as if the floodgates had opened and every young man in the valley had been sucked into some culvert and randomly sprayed out like fertilizer into what the church called a mission field. Would Riley ever know if he really wanted this? What did he really believe? Was he just afraid of the consequences if he didn't go? He needed more than a borrowed opinion at this point. He needed to know. He turned into the gravel driveway and parked. The door of the car felt heavy as he pushed it shut. The ground was too uneven for his flip-flops. Noticing an unfamiliar station wagon out front, he assumed it was another of Gus's fans. The sprinklers were on, and two of Riley's sisters ran through them, their tiny, tanned bodies dancing through the spray that shimmered when it landed on the trees. He would soon leave them behind, their dress-ups, their laughs when Gus tickled them, the smell of their sound sleep when he walked into the nursery to wake them up for church. As he entered the front hall, he could hear Lucy's voice. Lucy is the hippie. She was here? She smiled so that her eyes became black slits as she pointed to Joan standing in her slippers, her hair smushed, an envelope in her hand. Riley looked back at Lucy talking on the phone. "Go on," she whispered. Then she narrated out loud for Leslie's benefit, her husband Leslie's benefit, the drama unfolding before her. "Joan is holding the envelope," she said. "Riley is in his shorts and t-shirt, looking tanned. Looking good, Ryle," she added as an aside. "Riley's walking to his mom. Joan is handing him the envelope. Ryle is sitting in the captain's chair in the living room. He's tearing it open like a crazy man. There's a pause. He's reading. New York City," Riley announced. "New York City," repeated Lucy into the phone. "Riley's crying. Joan is hugging him. Riley is going to the heart of Babylon." I determined at that point that it was time for me to make my appearance. So I opened the ceiling and let stream into the living room, and let light stream into the living room. I could hear Lucy on the phone, but she sounded far away. Starting from atop Squaw Peak, I descended in a white robe, open in the front, and swept through the pillar of light. I screamed through a hooked beak and hovered 3 feet above the floor as a voice crackled from above saying, "This is my servant." My beak plunged upward into the light. I screamed again, pulling the boy to me, the feathers of my head hard against his cheek, my beak lowering to his ear. I lifted him off the floor in my arms, my face twisted in agony. He dropped the letter. Under my robe, my body roiled with his own spasms and the beating of my wings. He went limp and fell to the floor, and I left through a fissure. In a blink of light, I was gone. There was wetness all around and the smell of musk. He was kind of daring. More drama than had really been asked for. Varys called me on it. "Scenery chewing stuff," he said afterward. But I confess it gave me chills. The wings and everything, nice job. His remark made me blush. I was doing what I was called to, wasn't I? In any case, it's what the kid wanted. Thank you.